most of human history, predicting when the sun would vanish from the sky was a task that required generations of careful observation. You needed decades of data, collected night after night, season after season, year after year. You needed mathematicians who could work with numbers most people couldn't even comprehend, who could spot patterns in vast tables of observations, who could translate those patterns into predictions. You needed instruments calibrated to measure the movements of objects millions of miles away, devices that could track positions in the sky with precision measured in fractions of degrees. And even then, even with all of that accumulated knowledge and all those specialized tools, you were working with approximations, refining predictions that your predecessors had started and that your students would continue after you were gone. This was simply how it worked. This was the nature of astronomical prediction for thousands of years. Understanding the cosmos meant standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before you, building on centuries of accumulated knowledge, adding your small piece to an enormous puzzle that humanity had been assembling since we first looked up at the night sky and wondered what those lights were doing up there, where they came from, where they were going. Progress was slow. It was incremental. It was collaborative across generations, across cultures, across centuries. Knowledge accumulated like sediment in a river delta, layer upon layer, each generation adding what they learned to what their teachers had known. You couldn't skip steps. You couldn't jump ahead. You needed that foundation, that vast accumulation of data and observation and mathematical technique built up over lifetimes of patient work. But there's an object that challenges everything we think we know about that progression. An object that could model the movements of the sun and moon with mechanical precision. An object that could tell you, years in advance, exactly when an eclipse would occur and where on Earth you would be able to see it. An object that could track the irregular motion of the moon as it sped up and slowed down in its elliptical orbit. An object that could display multiple calendar systems simultaneously. That could track the wandering paths of planets through the constellations. An object built more than 2,000 years ago, in an era we generally think of as ancient, primitive, fundamentally limited in its technical capabilities. This device appears in the historical record centuries, perhaps over a millennium, before anything remotely comparable. It sits in our timeline like a glitch in a computer program, like something that wandered in from a different version of history entirely. It's technology that seems to belong to a later era, displaced backwards in time, existing in a period when nothing like it should have been possible, according to our standard narratives of technological development. For now, I'm not going to tell you its name. I'm just going to tell you that it's a corroded lump of bronze and wood that spent 2,000 years at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, and that when researchers finally understood what they were looking at, when they finally grasped the full sophistication of what this object could do, it fundamentally changed how we think about what ancient people were capable of. It challenged basic assumptions about technological progress, about the supposedly linear development of human knowledge, about what was and wasn't possible in different eras of history. Because something is profoundly out of place here. And the more you learn about this object, the more you understand its capabilities and its sophistication, the more you grasp the precision of its engineering and the depth of astronomical knowledge it represents, the more unsettling that displacement becomes. This isn't a simple tool that's slightly more advanced than we expected. This isn't an incremental step forward from known ancient technology. This is a complex computing device that appears centuries before anything similar, surrounded by absence, isolated in time. It's an anomaly, a discontinuity, a peak of capability surrounded by emptiness in the historical record. Let me take you back to the early 20th century, to a time before this object was known to modern scholarship, before anyone suspected that such devices had ever existed in the ancient world. Somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, off the coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera, positioned between the Peloponnese and Crete, a group of sponge divers are working at dangerous depths. These are professional divers, men who make their living harvesting sponges from the rocky seafloor and selling them at market. This is hard, physical labor. Brutal labor, really. These men are diving deeper than is truly safe with the equipment they have available. They're holding their breath longer than is comfortable, fighting the pressure and the cold and the darkness, searching for sponges they can sell. It's how they make their living. It's what they know. It's what their fathers knew, and their grandfathers before them. It's a family tradition, a way of life passed down through generations in these coastal communities. The work is repetitive, dangerous, and utterly exhausting. Day after day, dive after dive, descending into the cold, dark water, searching the rocky seafloor for sponges, bringing them up, preparing them for sale, then diving again. Most days are completely routine. Most dives yield exactly what you'd expect, nothing more, nothing less. But not always. Not every dive. On one of these dives, probably in the spring of 1900, although the exact date is somewhat uncertain, one of the men finds something completely unexpected. A shipwreck. And not a recent one. This isn't a vessel that went down last year or even last century. This is old. Ancient. The remains of a ship that went down so long ago that it's become part of the seafloor itself, encrusted with marine growth, half buried in sediment. The wood mostly rotted away, leaving only scattered timbers and the cargo it once carried. Now, finding shipwrecks in the Mediterranean is not particularly unusual. These waters have been sailed for thousands of years. Countless vessels have gone down in storms, run aground on rocks, sunk in naval battles, or simply failed structurally and slipped beneath the waves. The seafloor in some areas is literally littered with the remains of ancient maritime traffic, layer upon layer of wrecks from different eras stacked on top of each other. But this particular wreck is substantial. It's not just a few scattered timbers and some pottery shards. This is a major find. As the divers explore it, as they carefully move sediment and marine growth aside to see what's underneath, they realize they found something genuinely significant. The ship is loaded with cargo, real cargo, valuable cargo. Bronze statues, some of them life-sized or larger, marble sculptures in various styles, pottery, high-quality pieces, not everyday tableware, glassware, luxury items, delicate vessels that somehow survived intact, jewelry, coins, all the kinds of things you'd expect on a Roman-era merchant vessel, transporting valuable goods from one wealthy port to another, carrying art and luxury items to patrons who could afford such things. This is an archaeological find worth reporting to authorities. This isn't just another shipwreck among thousands. This is a vessel full of artifacts that museums would want, that scholars would want to study, that would help us understand ancient trade routes and artistic styles and economic patterns. The divers surface and word spreads quickly through the small community. The Greek government gets involved. Academic institutions take interest. Wealthy collectors start making inquiries. Soon, proper archaeological recovery begins, organized and systematic rather than just treasure hunters grabbing whatever looks valuable. Teams are organized, procedures are established. Divers start bringing up artifacts systematically, carefully documenting what they find and where they find it, trying to preserve context and relationships between objects. It's slow, difficult work. Diving technology in 1900 is primitive by modern standards. There are no scuba tanks, no wetsuits, no underwater lights. The divers are working at depths that push the absolute limits of what's possible with the equipment available to them. But they persist, day after day, slowly recovering the cargo of this ancient vessel. Bronze statues come up, green with 2,000 years of corrosion, but still recognizable. Some are intact, miraculously undamaged despite their time underwater. Some are fragmentary, broken either in the original shipwreck or by the action of currents and time. All are valuable, all are worth preserving and studying. Marble. Figures emerge from the sediment, pale stone contrasting with the dark sea floor. Athletes, gods, portraits of long-dead Romans. Each one is carefully brought to the surface, documented, preserved. Glassware, miraculously unbroken after 2 millennia underwater. Delicate vessels that somehow survived when everything around them was being crushed and corroded and broken down by the sea. Jewelry made of gold, which doesn't corrode, still gleaming after all this time. Coins that will help archaeologists date the wreck, establish when this ship went down and where it might have been travelling. Pottery fragments by the thousands, pieces that will need to be sorted and catalogued and potentially reassembled, each one a small data point in understanding ancient trade and culture. It's a substantial haul, the kind of discovery that museums get excited about, that generates newspaper headlines, that represents years, potentially decades, of potential research and analysis. Everything gets catalogued, packed up carefully in crates, transported to Athens. Standard archaeological procedure for a shipwreck of this type. Document everything meticulously, preserve everything that can be preserved, study it all later when there's time, when resources are available, when the right experts can be brought in. Among all these items, among the statues and pottery and coins and jewelry, among all these obvious treasures is a lump of corroded bronze and wood. It's not particularly large, maybe the size of a shoebox, though it's hard to tell exactly because it's broken into several pieces. It's not visually impressive in any way. It's heavily mineralized, covered in exactly the kind of thick corrosion you'd expect from 2,000 years in salt water. The bronze has turned green and rough. The wood, what little remains, is dark and fragile, barely recognizable as having once been wood at all. It looks frankly like debris, like something that was part of the ship's structure, maybe some kind of fitting or fastener, or just random corroded metal that happened to be on board. Nothing special. Nothing worth particular attention. It gets stored alongside other fragments, catalogued as miscellaneous corroded bronze, because there's no obvious reason to pay attention to it or prioritize it for study. It's just one more piece of corroded metal in a collection full of corroded metal, one more item in a warehouse full of artifacts waiting for examination. Maybe someone will look at it more carefully someday, if there's time, if it seems worth the effort. But for now, it's just recorded in the inventory and set aside. And there it sits, for months, for years actually. Just another fragment in storage, one item among hundreds recovered from the shipwreck, waiting for someone to have time to look at it more carefully, if anyone ever does. Because there are priorities in archaeology, limited time and limited resources. You study the obvious treasures first, the intact, statues that can go on display, the identifiable artifacts that can tell clear stories, the things that obviously matter, that museums want, that the public will be interested in. Corroded lumps of bronze can wait. They'll still be there later. Here's the thing about archaeological finds, especially things recovered from the ocean after long periods of submersion. When you pull something out of the sea after it's been there for 2,000 years, it doesn't look anything like it did when it went in. The transformation is profound and often makes objects completely unrecognizable. Bronze corrodes in seawater. It develops a thick patina, layers of oxidation built up over centuries. What was once smooth, precisely machined metal becomes rough and pitted. Details disappear under the corrosion. Surfaces that once fit together precisely become distorted as the metal expands and contracts with oxidation. Wood disintegrates, or if it survives at all, in the anaerobic conditions of deep sediment. It becomes fragile and distorted, compressed by the weight of sediment, penetrated by marine organisms, barely recognizable as having once been a structural material. Everything gets covered in mineral deposits, in calcium carbonate precipitated, from the seawater, in marine growth of all kinds. Barnacles attach, corals grow, sand and sediment accumulate in crevices and become cemented in place. Things that were once precisely machined mechanical devices become unrecognizable lumps. Surfaces that were once polished and smooth become rough landscapes of corrosion. Details that were once crisp and clear become vague suggestions under layers of deposit. And if you don't know what you're looking for, if you have no reason to expect a certain type of object to exist in this time period, if you have no mental category for this kind of artifact, you can look right at it and not see it. You see corrosion, you see damage, you see a fragment of something that's been underwater too long, you see debris, and you move on to more obviously interesting artifacts, things you can immediately recognize and categorize. That's what happened with this fragment. Multiple people looked at it. Archaeologists, museum workers, researchers, all trained, professionals who knew their field. They saw a corroded lump. They saw broken bronze and deteriorated wood compressed together. They saw something that had obviously been underwater for a very long time. They saw what they expected to see, what made sense to see, what fit their mental models of what ancient artifacts looked like, and they moved on to other things, more obviously valuable things, things they could immediately understand, until someone, and we don't know exactly who or precisely when this happened, the records are incomplete, but at some point, someone noticed something in the corrosion that didn't fit. A crack had formed as the object dried out after being brought to the surface. The bronze had split slightly, the corrosion fracturing along a line of weakness, and through that crack, if you looked carefully, if you paid attention, you could see something that made no sense at all. There were shapes inside the corrosion, geometric shapes, repeating patterns, not random, damage, not the irregular patterns of corrosion and decay and mineral deposition. These were regular, symmetrical, clearly intentional. This was design. This was structure. Teeth, gear teeth, arranged in circles. Someone built this. Someone made these shapes deliberately, carved them or cast them with purpose. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a lump of metal that happened to corrode in an interesting pattern. This was something that had been constructed, something that someone had made with intention and skill. When they looked more carefully, when they started to very gently clean away some of the mineral deposits, when they examined the internal structure more closely with whatever tools they had available at the time, they found gears, bronze gears, small ones, precisely made, carefully shaped, and not just one or two, dozens of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell with all the corrosion, interlocking, meshing together, designed to move in specific relationships to each other. This was machinery, ancient machinery, mechanical engineering from an era when such things supposedly didn't exist, when technology was supposed to be simple and limited and primitive. And there was writing, fine Greek lettering, engraved directly into the bronze at a scale you'd need good eyesight to read, even when it was new and clean. Tiny letters, precisely formed, carefully placed. This wasn't decorative. The placement, the content, the way it was positioned on what remained of the device, this was clearly instructional. This was text meant to tell someone how to use something. This was a manual, operating instructions, a guide to the device's functions. Word spread among scholars. Experts started to gather, drawn by reports of this impossible object. People who knew ancient metalworking came to look at the bronze and the precision of the gears and tried to understand how such things could possibly have been manufactured with the tools available in ancient times. People who knew ancient Greek examined the inscriptions, translating them carefully, trying to understand what they described, what instructions they were giving. People who knew astronomy started to recognize references in the inscriptions to celestial bodies, to cycles, to predictions of astronomical events. They saw mentions of the sun and moon, of zodiacal constellations, of eclipse cycles, of calendar systems. And slowly, reluctantly, because it seemed completely impossible, because it challenged everything they thought they knew about ancient technology and ancient capabilities, they started to realize what they were looking at. This wasn't symbolic. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't art meant to represent something abstractly. It wasn't decorative, not primarily. It was functional. It had a practical purpose. It was designed to do something specific, to perform a particular task. It was a machine, a calculating machine, a device specifically designed to compute astronomical positions and predict celestial events mechanically. Let me describe what this object could do in detail, because until you really understand its full function and capabilities, you can't grasp why it's so profoundly out of place in the historical record, why its existence challenges our basic understanding of technological development. Imagine a wooden box, a rectangular case roughly the size of a shoebox, maybe slightly larger. The wood has mostly rotted away now after 2,000 years underwater, but we can see where it was. We can reconstruct the approximate shape and size from the fragments that remain and from the positions of the bronze components. On the outside of this box, on the front face and the back face, were bronze dials, circular displays with pointers that could rotate around them, showing various pieces of information. These weren't decorative. These were functional displays, meant to be read, meant to convey information clearly. Inside the box, protected from view but accessible if you opened it, was an intricate system of gears, bronze gears of many different sizes with different numbers of teeth cut into them, meshing together in very specific mathematical ratios. These weren't random. Each gear ratio was calculated to represent a particular astronomical relationship, a particular cycle or period. On the side of the box was a crank, a handle you could grasp and turn. And when you turned that crank, when you rotated it, the gears inside began to move. The main drive gear would rotate, and through the mesh of teeth, that rotation would be transferred to other gears, each turning at its own specific rate determined by the number of teeth it had. As these gears turned, as they rotated in their precise mathematical relationships to each other, pointers on the dials outside would move, not randomly, not approximately, but in patterns that exactly matched the movements of celestial bodies through time, as observed from Earth. This is fundamentally a mechanical model of the cosmos. It's an analog computer in the truest sense, a device that translates the rotation of a hand crank into the movements of the sun, moon, and planets through the sky. It's a mechanism that takes abstract astronomical knowledge, complex mathematical relationships and observed cycles, and makes them concrete, physical, something you can interact with directly without needing to understand the underlying mathematics. One of the primary things it could do, one of its main functions, was predict solar eclipses. And I want to be very clear and specific about what that means, because the precision involved here is remarkable. This wasn't approximate prediction based on observation and pattern recognition, the kind of thing where you look at records of past eclipses and make educated guesses about when the next one might occur, based on rough patterns you've noticed. This wasn't probabilistic forecasting. This was precise calculation, mathematical calculation, encoded permanently. In bronze, through carefully chosen gear ratios, solar eclipses follow a pattern called the Saros cycle. This is a period of exactly 6,585.32 days, which works out to about 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. After that very specific period, after that precise amount of time passes, the geometric relationship between the Earth, Moon, and Sun repeats almost exactly. The Moon returns to the same position in its orbit, at the same distance from Earth, at the same point in Earth's orbit, around the Sun, with the same angular relationship to the Sun. And when that happens, when all those factors align again, eclipses occur in very similar patterns. An eclipse that happens today will happen again, in a similar location on Earth, visible from similar latitudes after one Saros cycle. Not approximately. Precisely. It's one of the most reliable astronomical cycles we know. If you know this cycle exists, if you can track it precisely, if you can keep accurate count of where you are in the 18-year pattern at any given moment, you can predict eclipses years or even decades in advance with remarkable accuracy. The ancient Babylonians knew about the Saros cycle. They'd observed it through centuries of careful record-keeping, watching the sky night after night, recording every eclipse they observed, noticing that patterns repeated. They could use their knowledge of this cycle to make predictions. But they did it through mathematics, through calculations performed by highly trained astronomers working with extensive tables of numbers, doing arithmetic that required years of education to understand. The device had this cycle built into it. Physically, mechanically. There's a dial on the back of the mechanism, a spiral dial with markings carefully scribed along its length, and a pointer attached to a gear that moves around that spiral as you turn the input crank. That pointer tracks the Saros cycle. It moves through the complete 18-year pattern, marked off with indicators showing when eclipses would occur. You could turn the crank forward, advancing through time, watch the pointer move along the spiral, and see exactly when the next eclipse would occur. You could see where in the cycle you currently were. You could count forward to future eclipses or backward to past ones. You could check historical records against the mechanism's predictions to verify its accuracy. Think about what that means in practical, concrete terms. You're standing in ancient Greece, maybe in Rhodes or Corinth or Syracuse. You're a priest responsible for maintaining ritual calendars, or a scholar teaching astronomy, or a wealthy patron who commissioned this device and owns it. You want to know if there will be an eclipse 3 years from now. You want to know so you can plan accordingly, prepare rituals, warn people, demonstrate your knowledge. You don't consult charts. You don't do calculations on papyrus with ink and stylus. You don't need to be a mathematician who spent years studying astronomical tables. You don't need to understand the underlying mathematics at all. You walk over to this device sitting on a table or shelf in your home or temple or school. You turn the crank. You watch the pointer move through its mechanical dance. You read the dial. The information is right there, encoded in bronze, accessible through a simple physical action. That's it. The knowledge is embedded in the mechanism itself. The mathematics is built into the carefully calculated gear ratios. The prediction is automatic, mechanical, requiring no mathematical skill from the user. But it wasn't just eclipses. The device tracked many other astronomical phenomena, and each additional function reveals more about the sophistication of the knowledge that went into designing it. The device tracked the moon's motion through the sky, its position against the background of stars, its progress through the zodiacal constellations. And here's where it gets really interesting, where it reveals just how sophisticated the astronomical knowledge behind this device actually was. The moon doesn't move at a constant speed through the sky. Its orbit around Earth is slightly elliptical rather than perfectly circular, which means sometimes the moon is closer to Earth and sometimes it's farther away. When it's closer, at the point called perigee, it moves faster in its orbit. When it's farther, at apogee, it moves slower. This is basic orbital mechanics, a consequence of Kepler's laws, though of course ancient astronomers didn't know about Kepler or understand orbits in the modern sense. But they could observe the effect. They could measure the moon's changing speed through careful observation. They could track how many degrees per day it moved through the zodiac. And they could notice that this rate varied in a predictable pattern. This is called the first lunar anomaly in technical terms. Ancient Greek astronomers knew about it. They observed it carefully. They developed mathematical models to account for it, equations that could predict the moon's position even when it was moving at irregular speeds. But modeling this mechanically, building a physical device that actually represents this varying speed in its motion, that's genuinely complicated. That requires understanding the phenomenon well enough to figure out how to translate it from mathematics into mechanics, from abstract equations into physical gears that can move at varying speeds. The device did it anyway. There's a gear system inside, carefully designed and precisely built, that varies the speed of the moon pointer to match this irregular motion. It's not a simple gear train where everything rotates at constant ratios. It's a variable speed system using a brilliant technique where one gear moves on a slightly off-center axis, causing it to speed up and slow down cyclically as it rotates. This is sophisticated mechanical design. This is elegant engineering. This is someone understanding an astronomical phenomenon well enough to figure out how to model it physically how to build a device that automatically accounts for it in its motion, and it works. The mechanism, even corroded and incomplete, shows this system clearly. Researchers have reconstructed it, built working models, demonstrated that it functions exactly as intended. The moon pointer speeds up and slows down in its motion around the dial, matching the moon's actual behavior in the sky. That's remarkable. That's not just building a machine, that's understanding both astronomy and mechanics well enough to bridge between them, to translate astronomical observations into mechanical systems. The device tracked multiple calendar systems simultaneously, and this is important to understand because it reveals something about the complexity of ancient timekeeping and why a device like this would have been valuable. Ancient Greece didn't have one unified calendar that everyone used. Different city-states used different systems. Athens had its calendar, Corinth had a different one, Sparta had yet another. Some were primarily based on lunar months, trying to track the moon's phases for religious observances. Some tried to reconcile lunar months with the solar year, adding intercalary months when needed to keep agricultural festivals aligned with seasons. These calendars didn't align neatly with each other. A date in the Athenian calendar didn't directly correspond to the same date in the Corinthian calendar. Keeping track of multiple calendar systems, figuring out when specific festivals would occur in different cities, planning travel or trade or diplomatic missions across regions with different calendaring practices. All of this was genuinely complicated. The device could show you where you were in different calendrical cycles simultaneously. It could align solar years with lunar months with various ritual observances. It could help you navigate between different dating systems, figure out when specific festivals would occur, plan events according to multiple calendar traditions all at once. This wasn't just academic, this was practically useful. If you were a merchant planning trade routes, you needed to know when markets would be open in different cities, when religious festivals would close businesses. If you were a diplomat, you needed to coordinate meetings across different calendaring systems. If you were a priest, you needed to maintain multiple observances that were keyed to different astronomical cycles. There's also substantial evidence, though the mechanism is too incomplete to fully reconstruct this function, that it tracked the visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the 5 wandering stars that ancient astronomers could see moving against the fixed background of stars. Tracking these mechanically would have required additional gear trains beyond what we can currently see in the surviving fragments. Additional complexity. Additional levels of precision in manufacturing, because planetary motions are more complicated than the relatively simple cycles of the sun and moon. Planets appear to
move forward through the zodiac most of the time, but periodically they slow down, stop, move backward in what we call retrograde motion, then stop again and resume forward motion. This is an illusion created by the relative motions of Earth and the other planets as we all orbit the Sun, but from Earth's perspective, it looks like the planets are actually reversing course. Ancient astronomers observed this carefully. They developed mathematical models to predict these retrograde loops. Building a mechanical system that could model this motion would have been genuinely challenging. But there's evidence in the inscriptions and in fragmentary gear systems that suggests the mechanism attempted this, that it tried to mechanically model not just the simple cycles of sun and moon, but the complex wandering paths of the planets as well. Let me try to give you a vivid sense of what this looks like in operation, what it would actually be like to use this device, to interact with it as a tool for understanding the cosmos. You stand before the mechanism. It's sitting on a wooden stand or table, positioned so the main display is at a comfortable viewing height. The crank on the side is within easy reach. The whole device is maybe 1.5 feet tall, portable enough to move if needed, but substantial enough to sit solidly on its support. You reach out and grasp the crank. It's smooth under your fingers, worn from use, designed to rotate easily without excessive friction. You begin to turn it, applying gentle, steady pressure. Immediately you hear the gears meshing inside the wooden case, a soft clicking sound as bronze teeth slip past each other in their precise ratios. It's surprisingly smooth, well made, designed for easy operation. ancient craftsmanship at its finest. On the front dial, the main display that dominates the front face of the device, pointers begin to move at different speeds. It's mesmerizing to watch. One pointer shows the position of the sun through the zodiac, that band of constellations that marks the sun's apparent path through the sky over the course of a year. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. The 12 divisions of the year, familiar to anyone in the ancient Mediterranean world. The sun pointer moves slowly, steadily, taking a full turn of the crank to advance through just a few degrees. Because the sun takes a full year to complete its circuit, and a year is many days, and each turn of the crank represents one day or perhaps a few days, depending on how the mechanism is geared. Another pointer shows the moon, and it moves much faster. The moon completes its cycle in about 29.5 days, so its pointer races around the dial, lapping the sun pointer regularly. You can watch it speed up slightly as it approaches one side of the dial, slow down as it reaches the other side, that variable speed system working exactly as designed to model the moon's irregular orbit. As you continue turning the crank, you can watch the moon pointer circle the dial multiple times while the sun pointer completes just one circuit. You can watch them align, both pointing in the same direction, representing the new moon when sun and moon appear together in the sky. Then, watch them separate as the moon pointer races ahead, reaching the opposite side of the dial where it represents the full moon, sun and moon on opposite sides of Earth. Then, watch them align again, the cycle repeating, the phases of the moon playing out mechanically before you, reduced to the pure mathematics of circular motion and gear ratios. On the back of the device, if you walk around to look at the reverse face, there are different displays. Spiral dials, fundamentally different in design from the circular dials on the front. These spirals wind outward like the groove on a phonograph record, starting from a central point and coiling outward in expanding circles. One of these spirals tracks the Saros eclipse cycle over its full 18-year period. Imagine a spiral with markings along its length, divisions representing months or years. A pointer attached to a gear system follows this spiral path as you turn the crank, slowly progressing outward from the center. As you crank forward through time, advancing day by day through an imaginary future, the pointer spirals outward, passing markers that indicate when eclipses will occur. Some markers might be labeled for solar eclipses, others for lunar eclipses. Some might indicate where the eclipse will be visible, what time of day it will happen, how complete the obscuration will be. You can crank forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, watching the pointer spiral outward, seeing what eclipses lie in the future. You can crank backward, returning to the present or even into the past, checking the mechanism's predictions against historical records, verifying its accuracy. Another spiral tracks the Ecliptic calendar, a 76-year cycle used to reconcile lunar and solar calendars over longer periods. Even longer-term planning, even more complete modeling of celestial cycles. You could spend hours with this device, exploring its functions, watching the interplay of its pointers, understanding how solar and lunar cycles mesh together, seeing the mathematical relationships made physical and visible. This isn't observation of the sky. This is prediction. This is encoding of astronomical knowledge into a physical mechanism so complete, so well-designed, that anyone who knows how to turn the crank can access predictions that would normally require years of mathematical training to calculate manually. It's democratization of knowledge through technology. It's making complex information accessible through clever design. It's exactly what we try to do with computers today, just achieved through bronze and wood instead of silicon and electricity. Now let me tell you why this object shouldn't exist. Why it represents such a profound discontinuity in the historical record that it forces us to rethink our entire understanding of ancient technological capabilities. The technological context is completely wrong. Gear systems of this complexity, with this many interlocking components, all working together in precise mathematical ratios to produce coordinated outputs, don't appear again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. Not similar devices, not simpler versions, nothing at all. The next comparable technology we know of is medieval Islamic and European clockwork, devices built in the 13th and 14th centuries by master craftsmen working in the Islamic world and in European cities. These were impressive achievements, representing the cutting edge of medieval mechanical engineering. They required advanced metalworking skills, sophisticated mathematical knowledge for calculating gear ratios, and years of careful assembly and calibration. And even those early medieval clocks, as impressive as they were for their time, are noticeably simpler than the Antikythera mechanism. They have fewer gears, less complex interactions between components, simpler astronomical functions. We're not talking about a small gap in the historical record here. We're not talking about a technology that appears, develops gradually over a few centuries with incremental improvements at each stage and continues forward in a steady progression. We're talking about a massive gap, a chasm, over 1,300 years where nothing comparable exists in the archaeological record or the historical texts. That's more than a millennium. That's the entire span from the fall of the Western Roman Empire through the early medieval period, through the High Middle Ages, and into the early Renaissance. That's the time from Constantine to Dante, from the end of classical civilization to the beginning of the modern world. And nowhere in that entire vast span of time do we find devices of comparable complexity to this ancient Greek mechanism. Think about what that means. Think about the implications. Technology is supposed to develop continuously. Knowledge is supposed to accumulate, each generation adding to what came before. You're supposed to see a progression from simple to complex, from crude early attempts to refined later versions. But that's not what we see here. We see a peak of capability in ancient Greece, then nothing for over 1,000 years, then simpler devices appearing in the medieval period and slowly developing toward the complexity that ancient Greeks had apparently already achieved. That's backwards. That's not how technological development is supposed to work. The precision is wrong too, in ways that become more striking the more closely you examine the mechanism. The gear ratios are accurate to known astronomical cycles to a degree that seems almost impossible for ancient manufacturing techniques. The gears mesh smoothly, or did when the mechanism was new. The teeth are cut evenly, carefully shaped to transfer motion efficiently. The whole mechanism works together as a coordinated system where each component must be precisely made or the entire device fails to function. This isn't crude, ancient metalwork, roughly functional but obviously primitive. This isn't the kind of basic gear systems you might expect from ancient technology. This is precision manufacturing that required sophisticated tools, careful measurement, and deep understanding of how gears work. To give you a specific comparison that really drives home how sophisticated this is, consider medieval clockmakers. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, master craftsmen in places like Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and later in Italian and German cities were building mechanical clocks. These represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval engineering capability. These craftsmen had access to better metallurgy than ancient Greeks. They had more advanced tools. They had accumulated centuries of metalworking knowledge. They were, in theory, working with all the advantages of progress and accumulated human knowledge. And the devices they built were measurably cruder than the Antikythera mechanism. Their gears were less precisely cut. Their mechanisms were simpler, with fewer interacting components. They could tell time and maybe track some basic astronomical functions, but nothing approaching the sophistication of what this ancient Greek device could do. The Antikythera mechanism, built sometime around the 1st century BC, based on the best estimates we have, is more sophisticated than mechanical clocks built in the 14th century AD, 1,500 years later. Read that again slowly. Really think about it. A device from ancient Greece is more advanced than medieval technology from over a millennium later. Something built before the birth of Christ contains engineering more sophisticated than devices built during the Renaissance. That's not how technology is supposed to work. Things are supposed to start simple and get more complex. Knowledge is supposed to accumulate. Each generation is supposed to build on what came before, adding refinements, making incremental improvements, gradually pushing capabilities forward in a more or less steady progression. You don't jump straight to sophisticated multi-gear computing devices modeling complex astronomical phenomena, and then completely forget how to build them for over 1,000 years. That pattern doesn't fit any of our standard models of technological development. But that's exactly what the evidence shows. That's what this object proves beyond any reasonable doubt. There are no known predecessors to this device that survive in the archaeological record. There are no simpler versions that came before it, no intermediate stages that we can point to and say, look, here's the development path, here's how they progressed from basic gears to this complex mechanism. There are no practice attempts, no early prototypes showing cruder versions of the same concepts, no failed experiments that didn't quite work, no evolutionary sequence we can trace through the archaeological record, and critically, there are no known successors. Nothing picks up where this device left off, no next generation of improved astronomical calculators, no evidence that this technology spread to other regions or was further developed by later craftsmen. No continuing tradition of building devices like this that we can trace through the centuries. It's just this one object, this one example, alone in the historical record, surrounded by silence. It's a gap, a profound discontinuity, a sudden isolated peak of capability that appears and then vanishes, leaving barely any trace beyond this one surviving example. Historians and archaeologists are deeply, fundamentally uncomfortable with this kind of thing. It challenges our basic methodologies. We build our understanding of the past on patterns, on sequences, on tracing development over time. We like narratives of steady progress, clear developmental sequences where we can trace technology from simple beginnings through gradual improvements to sophisticated final forms. We like to see how things evolved, how knowledge accumulated, how each innovation built on previous work. We like continuity. We like being able to draw lines between point A and point B and point C, showing how one development led to another. Gaps make us nervous. They suggest our understanding is incomplete, that significant holes exist in our knowledge. Peaks followed by silence make us question whether our models of how history works are actually accurate. They force us to confront the possibility that the smooth narratives we construct about technological progress might be more fiction than fact, more imposed pattern than discovered reality. Because if something this sophisticated could be built in ancient Greece, if people 2,000 years ago had the knowledge and skill to create mechanical computers that wouldn't be matched for over a millennium, what else was possible that we don't know about? What other capabilities existed in the ancient world that we have no record of? What other technologies might have emerged briefly and then disappeared, leaving no trace because nothing happened to survive or because we haven't yet found the evidence? The mechanism forces us to completely reassess what ancient people were capable of. Not in a vague, general sense, not just acknowledging that they were clever and creative and accomplished remarkable things, but specifically, concretely, with evidence. They could design complex gear systems with dozens of components all interacting in precise mathematical relationships. They could manufacture those components to tolerances tight enough that the mechanism could function accurately for extended periods. They could calculate the gear ratios needed to model astronomical cycles with precision. They could encode sophisticated mathematical knowledge into physical mechanisms, translating abstract calculations into concrete mechanical operations. They could build devices sophisticated enough to predict eclipses years in advance, track planetary motions, reconcile multiple calendar systems. They could do all of this well enough that the end result worked reliably, well enough that someone thought it was worth the immense investment of time and resources to create, well enough that it represented valuable cargo worth transporting across the Mediterranean. That's not the ancient world we usually imagine. That's not simple tools and basic mathematics. That's not primitive technology and limited capabilities. That's precision engineering. That's advanced mathematical modeling translated into physical form. That's sophisticated astronomical knowledge combined with equally sophisticated mechanical design. And then it vanished. Completely. The knowledge disappeared, the tradition died out, the capability was lost, and for over 1,000 years, over 1,300 years in fact, nothing comparable was built anywhere in the Mediterranean world or beyond. So who built it? Where did this knowledge come from? How did they acquire the skills and understanding needed to create something this sophisticated? And perhaps most importantly, why was it made in the first place? What purpose drove the immense investment needed to design and construct such a device? The mechanism almost certainly originates from the Hellenistic scientific tradition. This is the period following Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire, roughly the last 3 centuries BC, when Greek culture and learning spread across a vast territory stretching from Greece itself through Egypt in the Near East all the way to the borders of India. It was a remarkable period of intellectual activity. Libraries were built, most famously the Great Library at Alexandria, but also significant collections in Pergamum, Antioch, and other cities. Museums were established, not in the modern sense of buildings displaying artifacts, but as institutions supporting research and scholarship. Mathematics flourished. Euclid systematized geometry. Archimedes made breakthrough discoveries in mathematics and physics. Apollonius developed sophisticated theories about conic sections. These weren't just abstract thinkers. They applied their mathematical knowledge to practical problems, to engineering, to astronomy, to mechanics. Astronomy was pursued with serious institutional support. We have their texts. We can read Ptolemy's Almagest, Hipparchus's calculations, the astronomical observations and theories developed across this period. We know they calculated planetary positions, predicted eclipses, developed sophisticated mathematical models of celestial motions. We know they were highly skilled metalworkers. We have examples of their bronze sculptures showing remarkable artistic and technical achievement. We have their weapons, their tools, their architectural fittings. We know they could cast complex shapes, join pieces precisely, work bronze to very high standards. What the mechanism proves, what it demonstrates beyond any doubt, is that they could combine these capabilities, that they could take astronomical knowledge and mechanical skill and mathematical understanding and bring them all together to create functional computing devices. But this wasn't one genius working alone in a workshop, building this device through individual brilliance and determination. That's not how something this sophisticated gets made. This required institutional knowledge, organized collaboration, systematic transmission of specialized skills. You need people who understand astronomy deeply enough to know what phenomena need to be modeled, what cycles matter for prediction, what precision is necessary for useful results. These are trained astronomers, people who've spent years studying the sky, learning mathematical techniques, working with observational data. You need mathematicians who can take astronomical observations and translate them into gear ratios, who can calculate that to model the moon's orbit, you need a gear with 53 teeth meshing with one with 96 teeth to approximate the ratio of the solar and lunar cycles, who can work out the complex ratios needed for the Saros cycle, for planetary motions, for all the various functions the device performs. You need metalworkers skilled enough to manufacture the components, to cast or cut gears with the right number of teeth, to shape those teeth precisely so they mesh smoothly, to join pieces so the mechanism works as a coordinated system rather than just a collection of parts. You need people who understand mechanics, who can design how all these gears will work together, how motion will transfer from one component to another, how to build a system where turning one input crank produces multiple coordinated outputs. You need specialized tools, lathes for turning the bronze gears to the right size and shape, cutting tools for forming the gear teeth precisely, measuring instruments for checking dimensions and tolerances, techniques for ensuring everything fits together properly. You need materials, high-quality bronze with the right properties for gear making, wood that won't warp or split, understanding of how different materials behave, how they'll respond to stress and use over time. And you need time. This isn't something you improvise quickly. This is years of work, years of design and calculation before any metal's even cut, years of construction and assembly, years of testing and calibration and refinement. That kind of project requires institutional support, workshops where this work can be done safely and efficiently. funding to support the craftsman during the years it takes to complete, patrons who value this kind of device enough to commission it, to pay for it, to wait patiently for completion. It implies training, systematic transmission of specialized knowledge from masters to apprentices. It implies a tradition, not necessarily of making astronomical devices specifically, but at least of precision mechanical work that makes building something like this possible. It implies libraries or collections of astronomical data that the designers could consult, records of eclipse observations going back centuries, tables of planetary positions, mathematical texts describing computational techniques. The society that produced this mechanism had all of those things. They were literate, with written texts and institutional libraries. They were technically skilled, with traditions of craftsmanship in multiple areas. They had institutional support for intellectual work, patrons willing to fund extended projects. They were deeply invested in understanding the cosmos, in tracking celestial motions, in being able to predict astronomical events. That's a sophisticated society. That's not a primitive culture barely getting by. That's a civilization with resources, with organization, with accumulated knowledge, and the institutions to preserve and transmit it. So why build it? What motivated the enormous investment of time and resources and specialized knowledge needed to create this device? There are several plausible answers, and, importantly, they're not mutually exclusive. This device could easily have served multiple purposes simultaneously, been valued for different reasons by different people. It could have been educational, a teaching tool for helping students understand celestial mechanics. If you're trying to teach astronomy, trying to help people understand how the sun and moon move, how eclipses happen, how the planets wander through the constellations, a working physical model is incredibly valuable. Instead of just describing these phenomena verbally or showing static diagrams, you demonstrate. You let students turn the crank. You let them watch the pointers move. You let them see relationships playing out mechanically before their eyes. That's powerful pedagogy. Learning through direct interaction with a physical model. It's much more effective than pure abstraction for most learners. You can talk about the Saros cycle all day, describe it in mathematical terms, write equations on papyrus. Or you can show someone the spiral dial with its 18-year pattern and let them crank through it, watching eclipses come and go in their regular rhythm. Which approach do you think would stick in memory better? Which would produce deeper understanding? It could have been religious, serving ceremonial or ritual purposes. Ancient Greece didn't separate astronomy from religion the way modern culture does. The movements of celestial bodies were deeply tied to religious observances, to ritual calendars, to determining propitious times for important activities. Eclipses were significant events, potentially omens that needed careful interpretation. Being able to predict them demonstrated special knowledge, perhaps even divine favor. The ability to say with confidence that an eclipse would occur on a specific date years in the future, and then have it actually happen exactly as predicted, that would carry enormous religious weight. A device that could predict these movements, that could help priests and religious authorities plan rituals correctly, interpret signs accurately, demonstrate their connection to cosmic order, would have significant religious value beyond its purely astronomical function. It could have been political, a tool for demonstrating knowledge and capability as a form of power. In the ancient world, understanding the cosmos, being able to predict celestial events, having knowledge that others lacked, that was genuine power. Imagine being a ruler or a wealthy patron who owns this device. You can predict eclipses years in advance. You can tell people when planets will appear in particular configurations. You demonstrate capabilities that seem almost magical to those who don't understand the underlying mathematics. That builds authority. That builds reputation. That demonstrates that you have access to special knowledge, perhaps even special favor from the gods. In a competitive political environment, in a world of rival city-states and ambitious individuals, that kind of demonstration of capability matters. It's not just abstract knowledge. It's practical political power, the ability to impress, to demonstrate sophistication, to show that you're operating at a level others can't match. Probably the mechanism served all of these purposes simultaneously. A tool for teaching that also had religious significance and that also demonstrated the intellectual sophistication and political importance of whoever possessed it. Multiple overlapping functions, multiple reasons different people might value it, multiple motivations driving its creation and use. What we know for absolute certain is that the society that built this device was remarkable. They had access to astronomical data accumulated over centuries of careful observation. They had mathematicians capable of extremely complex calculations. They had workshops that could manufacture precision components. They had the resources and institutional support to fund extended projects. They had all the elements needed to create something this sophisticated. And they did create it, and then something happened, and all of that capability gradually vanished. Here's what I find most haunting about this device, what keeps me thinking about it long after I've finished reading about it. It survived purely by accident. It was cargo on a ship. That ship sank in a storm or hit rocks or failed structurally. We don't know exactly how it went down. But it sank, and it happened to sink in water shallow enough, close enough to an island, in a location where 2,000 years later sponge divers would be working. Those divers happened to find the wreck, happened to recognize it as ancient and potentially valuable, happened to report it rather than just salvaging whatever looked immediately profitable, happened to bring up this particular corroded lump along with all the more obviously valuable cargo. That lump happened to end up in the hands of people who would eventually look at it closely, enough to see what it actually was, happened to crack in a way that revealed the gears inside, happened to attract the attention of scholars who could recognize its significance. Change any single one of those circumstances, and we would never know this device existed. If the ship reaches port safely, the mechanism gets delivered to whoever commissioned it or bought it. It gets used for some period of time, maybe years, maybe decades. Eventually it breaks down or wears out or is damaged. Maybe someone tries to repair it. Maybe they succeed. Maybe they don't. Eventually the owner dies or loses interest, or the device simply stops working and can't be fixed. What happens then? It gets discarded. Or more likely, given the value of bronze in the ancient world, it gets melted down for scrap metal, the bronze recycled into something else entirely. Either way, it disappears completely. No trace remains at all. Or the ship sinks in deep water, beyond the reach of ancient salvage efforts and beyond where sponge divers work even today. It settles on the sea floor in the darkness, slowly corroding, gradually disintegrating, and we never find it. It's still down there somewhere, unknown, unrecovered, lost forever in the Mediterranean depths. Or the divers notice the shipwreck, but this particular piece gets overlooked among all the other cargo. It's not visually impressive after all. It's easy to miss. It stays on the sea floor while statues and obvious artifacts are recovered. Eventually, sediment covers it, or currents carry it away, or marine organisms break it down. Gone. Or researchers look at it after it's recovered but don't look closely enough. They see corroded bronze, catalog it as miscellaneous metal fragments, and put it in storage where it sits forever, its significance never recognized. Any of those scenarios, any one of which is completely plausible, entirely ordinary, the kind of thing that happens all the time in archaeology, and this object vanishes from history without leaving a trace. And if it vanished, if we never found it, we would have no idea that ancient Greeks could build devices like this. We would assume, based on the complete absence of evidence, that mechanical computing devices weren't possible until the medieval period at earliest. We would write papers confidently asserting that certain capabilities required later developments in mathematics and engineering. We would construct narratives about technological limitations in the ancient world. We would be certain in our understanding, and we would be completely, utterly wrong. That's what haunts me. That's what keeps me awake at night thinking about this object and what it represents. Because if this device survived purely by accident, if it only reached us through an unlikely chain of circumstances, what else didn't survive? What other remarkable objects existed in the ancient world that we have absolutely no record of because nothing happened to survive long enough for us to find it? What other devices were built and used and eventually discarded or destroyed or simply lost to time? What other knowledge was developed and applied and then forgotten when transmission failed? What other capabilities emerged briefly in human history and then vanished without leaving enough trace for us to notice the gap? We literally cannot answer these questions. We have no way of knowing. And that's precisely what makes them so important to ask. Knowledge is fragile, much more fragile than we usually acknowledge, especially physical knowledge, practical knowledge, knowledge embedded in objects and techniques and practices, rather than written down in texts that can be copied and preserved across generations. If you have one master craftsman who knows how to build astronomical mechanisms, who understands all the gear ratios and assembly procedures and calibration techniques and all the little tricks and subtle knowledge needed to make them actually work, and that person, without training a successor, the knowledge dies with them. You don't need catastrophic collapses. You don't need barbarian invasions burning libraries. You don't need deliberate suppression or destruction of knowledge. You just need a failure of transmission. Just one generation that doesn't pass on what they learned. Maybe they're too busy with other concerns. Maybe there's a war or economic disruption that interrupts normal patterns of master training apprentices. Maybe the market for such devices dries up, so there's no economic motivation to maintain the skills. Maybe social priorities change, and talented young people pursue different kinds of knowledge instead. Any of those breaks the chain. And once the transmission fails, once that crucial generation doesn't pass the knowledge forward, it's gone. Maybe someone remembers that devices like this used to exist, can describe them in vague terms, knows they were possible. But that's not enough. You can't rebuild from vague memories. You need the specific technical knowledge, the detailed procedures, the accumulated tricks and techniques that make the difference between a design that almost works and one that actually functions reliably. Without that transmission, later generations have to rediscover everything from scratch. They have to independently figure out solutions to problems that were already solved centuries earlier. They have to reinvent techniques that were already developed and refined and perfected. The ancient world experienced wave after wave of disruption. Wars, obviously, though warfare was more or less constant background noise. Economic shifts as trade routes changed and markets developed and collapsed. Political transformations as empires rose and fell and borders shifted. The transition from classical paganism to Christianity represented a fundamental change in social priorities and institutional support. What got valued changed. What got funded changed. Where talented people directed their energy changed. Centers of learning declined. The library at Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was damaged in various incidents, lost portions of its collection, eventually ceased to function as a major center of scholarship. Other libraries suffered similar fates. Museums closed, schools shut down, networks of scholars fragmented, patronage patterns shifted. Wealthy individuals who might once have commissioned astronomical devices or supported craftsmen who could build them turned their attention and resources to different priorities, churches instead of libraries, religious texts instead of astronomical computations. Craft traditions were quietly abandoned because there was no longer a market for their products. If no one wants to buy astronomical calculators, if the people who might have commissioned such devices are gone or have different interests, then the craftsmen who could build them find other work. Their children learn different trades. The specific skills needed to construct these devices simply aren't passed on. Most of this wasn't deliberate destruction. It wasn't book burning or suppression. It was just entropy, the natural process of societies changing and priorities shifting and knowledge that isn't actively maintained gradually fading away. The mechanism survived because it was lost before any of that could happen to it. It went to the bottom of the Mediterranean in the 1st century BC, before the transition to Christianity, before the decline of Hellenistic institutions, before the economic and political transformations that would reshape the Mediterranean world. It spent 2,000 years in salt water, corroding slowly, protected from all the changes happening in the world above, while the civilization that built it transformed beyond recognition. While the knowledge of how to build such devices was lost, while similar technology wouldn't appear again for over a millennium, The mechanism sat in darkness on the sea floor. By the time sponge divers brought it up in 1900, nobody remembered that such devices had ever existed. There was no tradition of mechanical astronomy, no institutional memory of precision gear work, no knowledge base to draw on for understanding it. We had to figure out what it was from complete scratch, approaching it like archaeologists from an alien civilization trying to understand a mysterious artifact. We used X-rays to see through the corrosion and map the internal structure. We used special photography to reveal faded inscriptions invisible to the naked eye. We reconstructed gear ratios mathematically and figured out what astronomical cycles they represented. It took decades of work, multiple researchers across multiple institutions, new technologies for imaging and analysis, careful, painstaking reconstruction of how the fragments fit together and what functions they performed. And we're still learning. Every few years, someone publishes a new analysis, a new reconstruction, a new insight into how it worked or what else it might have been able to do. The mechanism hasn't given up all its secrets yet. And here's what I keep coming back to, what seems most significant about this entire story. The mechanism doesn't rewrite history in some dramatic way. It doesn't prove that ancient people had electricity or computers or technologies we thought were modern inventions. The people who built it were still ancient Greeks living in the Hellenistic period. They still lived in a world lit by oil lamps and candles. They still traveled by foot and horse and sailing ship. They were still bound by all the limitations of their materials in their era. But within those limitations, they were capable of far more than we assumed, much more than we would have believed possible if we hadn't found direct physical proof. And that capability existed briefly, produced at least one remarkable object that we know of, and then faded away so completely that we forgot it ever existed. Until we accidentally pulled one corroded example out of the sea and slowly, over decades, figured out what we were looking at. Think about what that means for our understanding of history. We tend to assume that what survives in the archaeological record is reasonably representative of what existed. We look at ancient tools and buildings and texts, and we construct narratives about what ancient people knew and could do based on those surviving examples. But survival isn't random. It's deeply biased. Stone survives much, better than wood. So we have lots of stone tools and stone buildings, but relatively few wooden artifacts. Public monuments survive better than everyday objects, so we know more about temples and palaces than about ordinary houses. Texts that were considered important and copied multiple times survive better than texts that existed in only a few copies, so our understanding of ancient literature is skewed toward what later generations thought was worth preserving. Metal objects face particular survival challenges. Bronze was valuable. When something bronze broke or wore out, it usually got melted down and recast into something new. The bronze in this mechanism could easily have been turned into coins or weapons or tools if the ship hadn't sunk. That recycling means bronze artifacts are relatively rare in the archaeological record unless they were lost or deliberately buried. Complex devices face even worse odds. They're harder to make, so they're rare to begin with. They require specialized knowledge to build, so they're vulnerable to transmission failures. They serve specialized purposes that might not remain valued as societies change. When they break, they might not be repairable if the knowledge of how they work has been lost. The mechanism survived despite all these factors working against it. It's made of valuable bronze that should have been recycled. It's a complex device representing specialized knowledge that was vulnerable to transmission failure. It serves a specialized purpose that might not have remained valued. By all rights, based on everything we know about how artifacts survive or don't survive, we should never have found it. And if we hadn't found it, if that ship had reached port safely or sunk in deep water, or if the divers had missed it, we would assume, based on the complete absence of evidence, that ancient Greeks couldn't build mechanical computers. We would be confident in that assumption. We would write academic papers defending it. We would cite the absence of such devices in the archaeological record as proof that they weren't possible. And we would be absolutely, completely, catastrophically wrong. So what else are we wrong about? What other capabilities existed in the ancient world that we're assuming didn't exist because we haven't found evidence for them? That's not a question we can answer definitively. By definition, we can't know what we don't know. We can't prove that something existed if we have no evidence for it. But the mechanism should make us profoundly cautious. It should make us question confident claims about what was or wasn't possible in different historical periods. It should make us acknowledge that our picture of the past is necessarily incomplete, full of gaps and absences that might hide remarkable things. It should make us think differently about technological progress, about the supposedly linear development of human capability. We like to imagine progress as a steady upward climb, each generation adding to what came before, knowledge accumulating reliably and continuously over time. And in the very long run, averaged out over many centuries, that's broadly true. We do accumulate knowledge. We do build on previous discoveries. We do generally move toward greater capability and understanding. But in the shorter term, over decades or generations or even centuries, things are much messier than that smooth narrative suggests. Knowledge appears in some places and not others. Techniques are developed, used for a while, and then forgotten when circumstances change. Capabilities emerge, reach remarkable levels, and then decline as institutional support fades or economic conditions shift or priorities change. The mechanism is a reminder that human capability isn't a smooth upward line. It's jagged, irregular, full of peaks and valleys. It's contingent on specific circumstances, specific institutions, specific individuals. And when those circumstances change, when those institutions decline, when those individuals die without training successors, capabilities can vanish. Sometimes they're rediscovered later. Sometimes they're independently reinvented by later cultures facing similar problems. Sometimes they're just gone forever. And later, civilizations have to solve the same problems from scratch, with no knowledge that someone already figured it out centuries or millennia earlier. That should be humbling. Not in a pessimistic or defeatist way, but in a realistic way that acknowledges how fragile knowledge actually is.